Welcome to episode 1, where context is king.
You're here because you want more engagement, more delight, more fun, more learning. You're hungry for change and willing to take action.
If you're not prepared to be wrong, you'll never come up with anything original.
Welcome to the E-Learning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Sabramowitz.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
Let's take learning to the next level.
Hello. This is Anna Sabramowitz. Welcome. Thanks for tuning in. I'm glad you're here. I hope you're having a wonderful day, and I hope that whatever I'm talking about will actually make it a little bit better, Just hoping. Anyways, okay, so what I wanted to talk about today is context. Context in e-learning, context in designing e-learning scenarios. And the reason I bring it up is because I think a lot of people throw context around, and I am guilty of that. But I think that we don't do enough work adding context to what we mean by adding context. Get my drift? So, the reason I'm talking about this is because I read this article by Ethan Edwards, who I think is an amazing instructional designer. And he wrote this article that's called 3 Tips to Provide Meaningful Context, or E-Learning Under a Sea Pineapple, which I completely did not understand that second part because it refers to SpongeBob SquarePants, and I have not seen a single episode, and Ethan Edwards confirmed that he also has not seen a single episode of this cartoony show. And if you have, good for you. You probably have kids. Anyways, but the reason he was, basically the gist of the article was that because he travels so much for his work, he once in a while, when he gets to a new city, he tries to go to things that, fill his evenings instead of hanging out in the hotel room by his lonesome. So what he decided to do is go to this musical, which happened to be about, maybe before they went to Broadway, SpongeBob SquarePants, and he showed up. And he had no idea what it was going to be about. It was very fantastical, but there were so many things there that were not placed in context that basically he spent all of the show just trying to figure out what the heck was going on. And then he said that a lot of our learners feel the same way, that we as, instructional designers or e-learning developers, it's our own perspective, and we assume that the context is crystal clear to the people who are looking at, at our creations. And so he provided several tips on how to add good context. And really, when you think about context, or when I think about context, let's say, because I don't know what you're thinking, maybe we're aligned, is that context really is if you can answer several questions for the person who is going through your e-learning scenarios, right? And one of the questions is, and you've probably heard it, is what's in it for me? And it can't just be that we put the learning goals in the very beginning and the learner gets to see them and it says, by the end of this session, you will do this. That's not enough context. That's just, what we're going to get out of it, but it's not really usually in concrete terms as far as, the questions that you should be thinking about answering is when will I ever use this? Like for real? Not like just because I want to learn things for the sake of learning things like a lot of us try to do. Or why should I care? Now, when will I ever use this? Is a great question. I just want to return to it because I feel like we forget that our learners really want to be super efficient. They're like, listen, I only have 25 minutes to spare today and I want to spend it on stuff that's actually going to make me way awesomer at what I do, or it's going to help me be way awesomer at what I do. So I think what you could do, and this is a strategy that I love to use, is right in the very beginning, straight up tell them, you're going to use this the next time you write a check. You're going to use this the next time you talk to a customer about this. So be super clear about that context, right? You're going to use this then. And why should they care? And a learner will ask this, like, yeah, but why should I care about that? And that's actually quite important, because I think the motivation for learning doesn't just come from, sometimes can come from saying, can you learn this because it'll make you better so you can be more efficient, so maybe you can make more widgets in this amount of time and maybe make more money. However, a lot of times we have to instigate this kind of interior motivation. Like, how do I do that with e-learning, right? How do I make people care to learn this stuff? And you can do it actually several times, or in different ways. One is through story, by telling the story of somebody, and the story can be about somebody who's trying to overcome a challenge. And in some ways, your learner can be that person, or see themselves in that person. Hopefully they see themselves in the person that's there. And another way can be by showing them the consequences of missing this skill. And you can do that right up front with your designing scenarios as well, which is that instead of giving them any kind of setup, info, or anything, you just say, here's the situation. Okay, how would you solve this? And don't give them the answer, just tell them what happens as a result of making a decision. And this can be actually just a text-based question. But the challenge is that sometimes what people will figure out is that they already know what the right answer is. That's great. You've reworded them, and you can even confirm that. Or they'll find out that they have a gap, and now all of a sudden they want to know what they can do to fix it. So they'll be more interested in the information because now they know why they should care. So that's why when you're designing scenarios, it's important to have the consequences be a little more amped up than usual. They actually have to be a little bit more than meh, because you have to make people care. And so go for a worst case scenario. And you know what? It's okay, because it's not the real world. It's the place where you make magic happen so that they can practice in a safe environment and feel okay and still not hurt anybody, right? Maybe some egos, but who cares? It's the best place for that to happen. So Ethan gave us some 3 tips. Like one of them is understanding your audience, which is, when you're trying to answer those questions, like, when will I ever use this? Like, you can't actually answer that question until you know who your audience are, right? So then you're like, oh, well, who is going to use this? Why would they use it? In what situation? Because in order for me to make that statement happen at the very beginning, or at least tell a story, I really have to know who I'm talking to, right? Who is going to respond to this question? And so one of the pieces of advice that he gives, which I think is just amazing, and I think we just all forget this, and I feel like this is a common thread that all of us go through when we review each other's work, which I do quite often, and that's the fact that we are not our learners, and we design learning for us instead of designing learnings for strangers. And it's hard, right? I mean, this stuff is supposed to make us excited as well. But we can only talk from our own experiences. So that's why you are not your learner. That's why you need what he says. So when you understand your audience, you can't just talk to your subject matter expert. I mean, that's, to me, you got to talk to a subject matter expert. Because even if you're like the subject matter expert plus the designer, you can't see your own work or your own curse of knowledge, which is that you already understand things on such a deep level that it's hard for you to probably explain those minuscule steps that it takes to get to where you are today. So it's always good to have a second pair of eyes, but also it's also good to have a pair of eyes that's fresh, like fresh to the company or fresh off the front lines. Because let's admit it, we are most times, far removed from the actual place where the action happens. And so we make a lot of assumptions, and those assumptions sometimes are based on, what we see or what we think should be happening based on all the processes and procedures that are in place. But really, it's you need to get the context of what is really happening so that people who you're delivering this training to can actually relate to it because it speaks to them, because it speaks to their reality. It's not removed from what they're actually doing. That's why context is like so huge and also so misunderstood in so many ways, because we rarely go out and realize that that's the first thing we should be focusing on is context, not content, context. So other suggestions that Ethan had. Listen to your audience. And what he means by this is that, and this is kind of the iterative model. When you design, let's say, a scenario, and when I say design, I mean like you've got it down on a piece of paper, written out with some sticky notes, and you've got the branching kind of set up that way. That's your first prototype. You take a picture of that and you send it around to a couple of people. I say 3, 4, 5, just novices, and also just have them, let's say, or work through, if you can build a quick little activity, if you have a template for it, which really, in essence, a good scenario question is like a multiple choice question where each option leads to a different consequence and potentially some really good constructive feedback. So there's always that consequence there. So what you want to do is just the minute you draft that up without spending any more time on it, you put it out to people. And you put it out to people who are actually able to think about it in their context and say, hey, this is good, or no, wrong path, before you invest too much time. So that's the idea of that early input and iteration to see if you're on the right path. You're basically doing a bunch of testing, failing testing, but gathering feedback. And it's kind of like developing brand new software, which really is what you're doing. So getting that out quickly, having no ego, and also being supremely open to the fact that a lot of this stuff will not stick, and it being okay with that. And then adapt to your audience. I think this is always a challenge for us, because we're like, okay, let's just put stuff out there and make sure that, 80% of our staff get it. And that's kind of not possible, because we're not creating blockbuster movies in most cases, right? But also the idea is that blockbuster movies, let's say, because you're like, oh, these hit big audiences, if we tell a story, it'll resonate with enough people. But the thing is those things are just meant to entertain, and they're meant to have some sort of like a moral lesson, or some of them have no lessons at all, right? Movies are meant to entertain only. What we're trying to do, yes, we're trying to entertain, which is great because it helps people remember things, but we're also trying to teach. We're trying to change behaviors. And so if what you're trying to teach somebody's already got, or they're like, I'm never going to use that, then you've wasted their time. So really, this goes back to kind of knowing your audience. And one of the things that you can do is either figure out which skills, let's say, that you're trying to teach through your scenarios, which skills apply to certain branches of people that you've identified as your audience for this e-learning. And what you can do is either have people at the very beginning say, this is my job, and I'm going to click on this button, and it's going to take me to maybe the third scenario in, because that's where the context for me really begins. Or what happens is, and Ethan says it, that if you realize that the two streams of your learners are almost not, there's no congruence, there's no real overlap, or it's just too varied, you may simply have to create 2 different kinds of modules. But what I think is actually pretty genius if you set this up right, the scenario design model does not change. Not really. The models stay the same. What changes is the context. So if you already have really good assets in place that are your frameworks, then what you're doing is the building, it takes no time at all, because you already have those assets designed. What you're actually working with now is just making sure that the kinds of skills and the types of consequences that you're now plugging into your scenario models fit the target audience. So it's really more just asking better questions and typing versus becoming some sort of a, brand new from scratch builder. which I think is actually one of the best things about being an instructional designer. When you're able to actually talk to people and discover what those contextual pieces are. All right, well, I hope that was helpful and interesting, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And if you have any questions about this, feel free to email me. Have a great day.
This is the E-Learning Scenario Design Podcast with Anna Sabramowitz.